The African city history tried to erase, Great Zimbabwe and the mystery of the Stone Empire. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. There's a moment when you first see the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe that quietly dismantles a lot of assumptions. No pyramids, no towering columns with carved faces, just stone, stacked with such precision that it feels deliberate, calm, and completely confident. This isn't chaotic ruin, it's architecture. And not just architecture, but architecture that knew exactly what it was doing. Great Zimbabwe sits on a plateau in southern Africa, surrounded by rolling hills and open sky. From a distance, the structures almost blend into the landscape, like they grew there instead of being built. But once you're close, you realize how wrong that impression is. These walls are massive. Some rise over 30 feet high, and what's most striking is how they were built. No mortar, no cement, just stone blocks, carefully shaped and stacked so precisely that they held together for centuries. That alone should command respect, but for a long time, it didn't. When Europeans first encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they struggled with what they were seeing, not because the ruins were confusing, but because they were too impressive, too sophisticated, too clearly the work of a complex society. And instead of adjusting their understanding, many chose denial. They invented theories, Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical figures, anyone but the local African population. That reaction tells you as much about the observers as it does about the site itself. The name Zimbabwe comes from a Shona phrase meaning houses of stone. That's important because it tells you this wasn't some forgotten anomaly to the people who lived nearby. It was memory, heritage, known even if its full history had faded. Oral traditions preserved its significance long before archaeology caught up. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a city in the modern sense, with streets laid out in grids and dense housing packed together. It was something different, a ceremonial and political center, a place of power. The site is made up of several distinct areas: the hill complex, the great enclosure, and the surrounding valley ruins. Each seems to have served a different purpose. The hill complex, perched above the rest, feels ancient and symbolic. Narrow passages, high stone walls, limited access. This likely wasn't a residential area for ordinary people. It feels like a place of ritual, leadership, or both. Somewhere elevated, physically and socially. Below it sits the great enclosure, the most iconic structure at the site, a massive elliptical wall enclosing an open space. With an inner stone tower that still sparks debate, no one knows exactly what that tower was for. It's solid, no chambers, no obvious entrances, which rules out a lot of practical explanations. Some suggest it was symbolic, a representation of authority, fertility, or continuity. Others think it marked social boundaries, separating elites from the rest. Whatever its purpose, it clearly mattered. You don't invest that much labor into something trivial, and the labor here was immense. Quarrying stone, shaping it, transporting it, stacking it, all without metal tools capable of cutting stone the way we do now. This required organization, knowledge, and a surplus of resources. Which leads to the next major realization. Great Zimbabwe wasn't isolated, it was connected. Archaeological evidence shows that goods from as far away as China, Persia, and the Middle East made their way here. Porcelain, glass beads, gold. That means trade networks stretching across continents. The people of Great Zimbabwe weren't just surviving, they were participating in a global economy. Gold was key. The region is rich in gold deposits, and Great Zimbabwe likely controlled production and trade. That wealth would have supported elites, craftsmen, and large-scale building projects. It explains how such a site could flourish for centuries. At its height, between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe may have supported tens of thousands of people in the surrounding area, not all living inside the stone walls, but connected to them. Farmers, herdsmen, artisans, traders, a complex society with layers and roles. What's fascinating is how subtle the architecture is. There are no massive relief carvings boasting victories, no inscriptions declaring kings. Power here wasn't shouted, it was implied. Stone walls that guided movement, narrow entrances that controlled access, elevated spaces that separated leaders from others. Authority expressed through space, not spectacle. And then there are the Zimbabwe birds, soapstone carvings of stylized birds found atop pillars within the ruins. They're abstract, almost modern in their design. These weren't decorations for decoration's sake. They were symbols, likely representing spiritual authority, ancestors, or royal power. They mattered enough to be placed high, visible and enduring. What's striking is how little writing we have from this culture. No stone inscriptions telling us who ruled, when wars were fought, or how the city was founded. That absence has often been used to dismiss or minimize Great Zimbabwe's significance. But writing isn't the only measure of complexity. Memory can be carried in architecture, ritual, and oral tradition. For centuries, the city thrived, and then, gradually, it declined. Why is still debated. Environmental pressure is one explanation: overgrazing, deforestation, resource depletion. As the population grew, the land may have struggled to sustain it. Trade routes may have shifted. Political power may have moved northward, giving rise to successor states like Mutapa. What's important is that the decline doesn't look like collapse through violence. There's no clear evidence of invasion or destruction. Instead, it feels like a slow transition. People moved, power relocated. The stone remained. That's another thing that makes Great Zimbabwe so haunting. It wasn't destroyed, it was left behind. When later European explorers and colonists encountered the ruins, they didn't see continuity. They saw mystery, and rather than listening to local knowledge, they imposed their own stories. For decades, official narratives denied African authorship entirely. Even when evidence mounted, those ideas lingered. It took a long time for the truth to be fully acknowledged. That Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the Shona people, that it represented indigenous African innovation, organization, and authority, and that denying that truth had been a political act, not an academic one. Once you accept that, the ruins take on a different weight. They're not just ancient stones, they're evidence of erased confidence, of stories deliberately sidelined, standing inside the great enclosure. You can feel how intentional everything is: the curve of the wall, the way sound behaves, the sense of enclosure without confinement. This was a place designed to shape experience, to communicate power without words, and maybe that's why Great Zimbabwe still resonates, because it challenges a deeply ingrained myth, the myth that complexity, monumentality, and global connection only emerged in certain parts of the world. This city of stone stands quietly as proof that human ingenuity has always been widely distributed. The mystery of Great Zimbabwe isn't really about who built it anymore. That question has been answered. The deeper mystery is why it took so long for that answer to be accepted, and what other stories are still waiting beneath the weight of assumption. When you let that sink in, the stones stop being silent. They start asking questions about history, about power, about who gets to decide what counts as civilization. And that's when you realize that Great Zimbabwe isn't just a ruin from the past. It's an ongoing conversation, one we're still learning how to have honestly. What makes Great Zimbabwe linger in the mind isn't just its scale or age, but its restraint. This was a society that didn't carve its history into every surface, didn't announce itself with towering statues or endless inscriptions. Instead, it expressed identity through structure, placement, and continuity. That kind of confidence is rare, and it doesn't need spectacle to prove itself. The dry stone construction is a perfect example. Anyone who has worked with stone knows how unforgiving it is. There's no margin for error. Each block has to fit. Weight has to be distributed correctly. Angles matter. And here, across acres of land, that precision is consistent. This wasn't experimentation, it was mastery. The stones themselves weren't cut with metal saws. They were shaped by hammering and chipping, likely using harder stones. That takes time, patience, skill passed down through generations. You don't arrive at this level of craftsmanship overnight. Which tells us Great Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated flash of brilliance. It was the product of a long architectural tradition. And yet, that tradition was almost erased from global memory. The damage done by early misinterpretations of Great Zimbabwe can't be overstated. For decades, the site was used as evidence to support racist ideas about African incapacity. Even when archaeological evidence clearly pointed to local origins, those conclusions were suppressed or ignored. The ruins were literally reinterpreted to fit a narrative that excluded African achievement. That's part of the mystery, too. Not the stones themselves, but how history chose to look away from them. Once you strip away those distortions, a far more interesting story emerges. One of regional power, economic sophistication, and cultural continuity. Great Zimbabwe wasn't alone. It was part of a broader network of stone-building societies in southern Africa. Mapungubwe came before it. Mutapa followed. Power shifted, but knowledge endured. What's fascinating is how leadership appears to have functioned here. There's no evidence of palaces in the way we imagine them. Instead, authority seems to have been spatial. Who could access which areas? Who lived closer to the walls? Who occupied higher ground? Power expressed through proximity and movement rather than overt domination. That kind of system relies on shared understanding, social contracts, ritual reinforcement. It suggests a society where legitimacy mattered as much as force. The soapstone birds reinforce that idea. They weren't mass-produced symbols. Each is slightly different, unique. That individuality hints at layered meaning, possibly clan identifiers, possibly representations of spiritual intermediaries. Whatever they symbolized, they were important enough to be elevated, literally and figuratively. And then there's the sound. People who spend time within the stone enclosures often notice how acoustics behave. Voices carry in certain ways. Echoes form unexpectedly. In narrow passages, sound compresses and amplifies. That's not accidental. Anyone who designs stone spaces learns quickly how sound behaves within them, whether consciously or intuitively. The builders of Great Zimbabwe shaped auditory experience as well as visual. That matters if ceremonies were held here, if leaders spoke to groups. If ritual chants were part of communal life, stone doesn't just frame space, it shapes sensation. One of the more subtle mysteries is how daily life unfolded around these monumental spaces. The valley ruins show evidence of domestic structures made from perishable materials. Wood, clay, thatch. Those buildings are gone now, leaving the stone as the most visible legacy. But that doesn't mean stone was the whole story. It was the anchor, the permanent core around which everyday life revolved. That imbalance in preservation has skewed perception. We see stone and assume monumentality. We forget the organic world that once filled the gaps. Gardens, livestock, markets, fires, conversations. All the things that turn architecture into a living place. When the city declined, people didn't vanish. They moved, they adapted, they carried knowledge with them. The successors to Great Zimbabwe didn't replicate it exactly, but they inherited its principles: control of trade, strategic placement, symbolic authority. That continuity undermines the idea of lost civilizations. Great Zimbabwe wasn't lost, it transformed. What was lost was recognition. The name itself tells you that. Houses of stone, not ruins of foreigners, not mystery structures, houses, lived in, understood, remembered. What tends to unsettle people is how this story clashes with the version of African history many grew up with. One that minimizes complexity before colonial contact. Great Zimbabwe stands as a direct contradiction, and contradictions make people uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't a flaw in historical inquiry. It's a sign that something important is being examined. There's also a lesson here about how we define civilization. Writing systems, monumental art, urban density. These are often treated as universal benchmarks. But Great Zimbabwe reminds us that societies can be complex, powerful, and interconnected without fitting neatly into those categories. Stone walls can be texts, spatial organization can be law, oral tradition can be archive. And when you accept that, the mystery of Great Zimbabwe becomes less about unanswered questions and more about reframing old ones. The City of Stone doesn't ask us to marvel at its builders as an exception. It asks us to recognize them as part of a broader human story that was always there, even when we refuse to see it. Walking through the ruins today, you're struck by how peaceful it feels. Not ominous, Not haunted, just present. The stones don't feel like they're guarding secrets. They feel like they've already told their story and are waiting for us to catch up. And maybe that's the final mystery. Not how Great Zimbabwe was built or why it declined, but why acknowledging its full significance took so long. Why stone walls had to endure centuries of misinterpretation before being allowed to speak truthfully. The City of Stones still stands, not as a riddle to be solved, but as a statement, a reminder that history is larger, richer, and more complex than the stories we inherit, and that sometimes the greatest mystery isn't hidden in the ruins themselves, but in the way we choose to look at them.